Hello everyone! So today we will discuss about language history and change. We are from the 9th team with the members. The first is Selma Arifah Zayan, second is Nuranisa Wulandari, third Fatimah Az-Zahra, and the last one is me, Alfiatur Rama Az-Zahra. Okay, so the theme of presentation today is language history and change with sub-theme. The first is family trees, family connection, cognates, and will be presenting by me. Second is comparative construction, sound and word, and will be presenting by Fatimah Az-Zahra. The next is the history of language, Old and Middle English and sound, synthetic and semantic change will be presenting by Shelma. And the last one, diachronic and synchronic variation will be presenting by Nuranisa. Well, let's move to the first material. Investigating the features of older language and the ways in which they developed into modern language involves us in the study of language history and change, also known as philology. In the 19th century, philology dominated the study of language, and one result was the creation of family trees to show how language were related. Before all of that could happen, however, there had to be the discovery that a variety of language spoken in different parts of the world were actually members of the same family. Family trees invented in the 19th century. It is one of the results of philology dominating the study of language. Family trees used to describe the common ancestor. Scholars set out to identify the branches of the Indo-European family tree, tracing the lineage of many modern languages. We can see on the pictures, the accompanying diagram show a small selection of the Indo-European language in their family branch, the large population and distribution family language in the world. Family connections. Two modern languages such as Italian and Hindi would seem to have nothing in common. One way to get a clearer picture of how they are related is through looking at records of an older generations, like Latin and Sanskrit, from which the modern language evolved. We can see on the pictures, Sanskrit, Latin, and English, it's similar to pronouns. Within groups of related language, we can often find close similarities in particular sets of words. A cognate of a word in one language, like English, is a word in another language, like German, that has a similar form and is or was used with a similar meaning. For example, you can see on the pictures.
Comparative reconstruction. Using information from this set of cognates, we can embark on a procedure called comparative reconstruction. The aim of this procedure is to reconstruct what must have been the original or proto-form in the common external language. In carrying out this procedure, those working on the history of language operate on the basis of some general principle, two of which are present here. The majority principle is very straightforward. If in a cognate set, 3 words begin with a P sound and 1 word begin with a B sound, then our best guess is that the majority have retained the original sound. The most natural development principle is based on the fact that certain type of sound change are very common, whereas out are extremely unlikely. The direction of change described in each case 1 until 4 has been commonly observed, but the reserve has not. The first is final vowel often disappear. The second is voiceless sound become voice, typically between vowel. The third is stop become fricative, and the fourth, the last but not least, constant become voiceless at the end of word. Sound reconstruction. If we were faced with some example from three language as shown below, we could make a start on comparative reconstruction by deciding what was the most likely form of initial sound in the original source of all three. Look at the table below. Language A is for Italian language, B for Spanish language, and C for French language. On the evident present, the majority principle would suggest that the initial sound in language A and B is older than the sound in language C. Moreover, the language A and B sound is a stop constant, and the C language sound is fricative. It's a fricative. According to one part of the most natural development principle, change tend to occur in the direction of stop becoming fricative. So the A and B sound is more likely to have been the original. Through this type of procedure, we have started on the comparative reconstruction of the common origin of some word in Italian, Spanish, and French. In this case, we have a way of checking our reconstruction because the common origin for these three languages is known to be Latin. When we check the Latin cognate of the word listen, we find cantare, cantena, carus, and cabalus confirm the A and B was initial sound. Word reconstruction. Looking at a non-Indo-European set of examples, we can imagine receiving the following data from a linguist recently returned from an expedition to a remote region of the Amazon. The examples are a set of cognates from three related languages, but what would the protoform have looked like? Look at the table below. Using the majority principle, we can suggest that the older form will most likely be based on language 2 or language 3. There is a pattern in this change that follows on one part of the most natural development principle, i.e. voiceless sound become voiced between vowels. So the word in language 2 and 3 must be older form than those in language 1. Remembering one other most natural development type of sound change, we can propose that the word in language 3 have consistently lost the final vowel still present in the word of language 2. Our best guess, then, is that the forms listened for language 2 are closest to what must have been the original protoforms.
Okay, thank you for the time. Before I explain further into the history of English, we have talked about comparative reconstruction. It is actually an attempt to figure out what the old language must have been like before any written records. However, even after we have found the early period written records, they most likely don't resemble today's written language. This is the Lord's Prayer from around year 1000 as an example. On the first glance, they probably look way too foreign to be counted as English. It is because there are many old letters that had undergone changes through time. To dive more into how English has evolved, let's take a look at the history of English. The periods of English history are divided into four periods. The first period is the Old English period, which is the period before year 1100, and the second period is the Middle English period, which starts from 1100 until 1500, and then the third period is the Early Modern English period that starts from 1500 until 1700, and then the last one is the Modern English, which starts from 1700s until now. And in this occasion, we will focus more on the Old English and Middle English period. Did you know that Britain people didn't speak English before? Most of Britain had been under Roman control, although the native inhabitants were the Celts, speaking various forms of Celtic, which gives us present-day Welsh, Irish, Gaelic, and Breton. No doubt that many Celts also spoke Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. According to Bede, an 18th century historian, three Germanic tribes called the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes proceeded to establish a base for themselves in the 5th century. They arrived in the island of Britain during the reign of the Roman Empire. They are the Anglo-Saxons. The language they spoke was called English, now called Old English. and they couldn't have been very different from the language spoken in their previous lands. Of course, if you compare present day English with German or Dutch or Frisian, you will immediately notice many differences. In the last 1500 years, English has grown less and less Germanic in character. From the Old English, we have many of the most basic terms in the language, such as man, weave, chill, hus, mete, etan, trinkan, fiotan. These pagan settlers also gave us some weekday names, commemorating their gods Woden and Thor. However, they didn't remain pagan for long. From the 6th to the 8th century, there was an extended period during which these Anglo-Saxons were converted into Christianity, and a number of terms from Latin came into English at that time, such as angel, candle, church, and others. Okay, moving on to the Middle English period, the event that marks the end of the Old English period and the beginning of the Middle English period is the arrival of the Norman French in England in year 1066. These French-speaking invaders became the ruling class, so for the following 200 years, the language of the nobility, the government, the law, and the civilized life in England was French. It is the source of words such as army, court, defense, faith, prison, and tax. But because the French-speaking invaders are the ruling class, the language of the peasants remained English. The difference of class could be clearly seen by their dictions. For example, the peasants who worked on the land, they formed words adopted from their Old English, such as sheep, cows, and swine, while the upper classes talked about mutton, beef, and pork, which are words from French origin. In this period, French was considered the prestige language, and Chaucer tells us through one of his Canterbury Pilgrims, as seen on the screen, especially the last line. En Français spoke, full fire and fetisly. Geoffrey Chaucer himself is a famous Middle English poem, and not only is he a poem, he is also the father and the founder of English far before Shakespeare was even born. His well-known masterpiece is called The Canterbury Tales. From this example of poem written in the late 14th century, we can see that there had been some changes from the Old English, but several changes were yet to take place before the language took on its modern form. Most significantly, the vowel sounds of Chaucer's time were very different from those we hear in similar words today. In fact, I probably didn't pronounce the poem right because the Middle English pronunciation had went through what we call as the Great Vowel Shift. The effect of this phenomenon is a general raising of long vowel sounds. For example, O becomes U, like Mona becomes moon. It creates the pronunciation of early modern English beginning around 1500, and it is a really huge difference. There are influences from the outside that causes external change in the language, such as the borrowed words from Norman French or Old Norse. There are also types of change that occurred within the historical development of English that don't seem to be caused by outside factors. It is called the internal change, and we will talk more about this. Okay, the first internal changes is the sound changes. The first sound changes is the sound loss. What is a sound loss? It is when some sounds disappeared from the pronunciation of certain words, like the initial H of many Old English words was lost. Look at the example. Lot becomes loud. Clafford becomes Lord. Some other words lost their sounds, but they kept the spelling, resulting in the silent letters of contemporary written English. For example, K and G are no longer pronounced before the nasals, but we still write the words ni and now with the remnants of earlier pronunciation KNEE and GNAW. Another example is a velar fricative that was used in the older pronunciation of nicht. It is closer to the modern German pronunciation, and the word is Nacht, but it is absent in the contemporary form of English, which is night. The second sound change is called the metathesis. It involves a reversal in position of two sounds in a word. For example, action becomes ask, breathe becomes bird, first becomes first. Metathesis is also present within the modern English in form of a dialect variant. For example, the cowboy who pronounced the expression pretty good as something close to pretty good. The third sound changes is known as epenthesis. It involves the addition of a sound to the middle of a word. For example, empty becomes empty. Spinel becomes spindle. The addition of a p sound after the nasal, as in empty, can also be heard in some speakers' pronunciation of something as something. And then the last sound changes, we have prothesis, which is the addition of a sound in the beginning of a word. It is like epenthesis, but in the beginning of a word. For example, Scola becomes escuela, spiritus becomes espiritu. In the modern setting, Spanish speakers who are starting to learn English as a second language will sometimes put a prothetic vowel at the beginning of some English words. For example, like estrange for strange and estory for story. Moving on to the second internal changes, we have the syntactic changes. Some noticeable differences between the structure of sentences in Old and Modern English involve word order. In the Old English text, we find the subject-verb-object order most common in Modern English. But we can also find a number of different orders that are no longer used. For example, the subject could follow the verb, so it's verb plus subject. For example, verdehi, he traveled. The use of the negative also differs from the modern English. During the Old English, a double negative construction was also possible, where both ne means not and never means never are used within the same sentence. In the modern English, we will say you never gave. But in Old English, the structure will change into double negative, which is you not gave never. However, the most drastic change in the form of English sentences was the loss of a large number of inflectional suffixes from many parts of speech. For example, silde means he gave, and sildest means you gave, are differentiated by inflectional suffixes of e and est. They are no longer used in modern English. And then the last internal changes is the semantic changes. The most obvious way in which modern English differs from Old English is the number of borrowed words that have come into the language since the Old English period. Less obviously, we have many words that we no longer use. For example, foin, that means the trust of us word is no longer used because most of the modern people now don't use words anymore. There are also many expressions that we don't use anymore, like low, verily, and egot. Egot is actually replaced by like, oh my god, or something like that. And then we have broadening and narrowing. The example of broadening the meaning is holiday. Holiday used to be a religious feast, but nowadays it means the very general break from work, called holiday. And then the example of narrowing, we have hunt, which means any kinds of dogs in the Old English, that becomes hound, that means a specific breeds in modern English.
Thank you, Riza, for explaining the previous material. Okay, now I will explain the last material, which is about diachronic and synchronic variation. Next, in this unending process where each individual child has to recreate the language of the community, there is an unavoidable propensity to pick up some elements exactly and others only approximately. There is also the occasional desire to be different. Given this tenuous transmission process, it should be expected that language will not remain stable and that change and variation are inevitable. In this chapter, we have concentrated on variation in language with diachronic and synchronic variation. The first is diachronic. Diachronically, that is from the historical perspective of change through time. And the second is synchronic. Synchronically, that is in terms of differences within one language in different place and among different group at the same time. Next. Okay, that's all an explanation from our group. We hope you guys can understand it. Thank you for your attention. Sorry if we have a lot of mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.